Intentional torts. What are the 7 intentional torts? Hint, remember ABC fit. 1. Assault. 2. Battery. 3. Conversion. 4. False imprisonment. 5. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. 6. Trespass to land. 7. Trespass to chattels. What 3 elements must a plaintiff prove to demonstrate an intentional tort? Hint, remember Vic. 1. A voluntary act. 2. Intent. And 3. Causation. What does it mean to act intentionally? To act intentionally means that a party, 1. Desires to bring about the harm or contact, or 2. Believes that the harm or contact is substantially certain to occur. What is the rule to remember for the doctrine of transferred intent? The intent to harm one party can be transferred when 1. The defendant had the intent to commit a tort against one particular individual, and 2. If in the act of trying to accomplish the tort, either 1. Commits a different tort against that person, or 2. Another person is injured by the same tort as intended, or a different tort that in fact resulted. To what intentional torts does the doctrine of transferred intent apply? 1. Battery. 2. Assault. 3. False imprisonment. 4. Trespass to land. And 5. Trespass to chattels. What is the rule for battery? A battery occurs when a defendant 1. Intentionally, 2. Causes, 3. A harmful or offensive contact, 4. With the plaintiff's person. When is contact harmful or offensive? A bodily contact is offensive if 1. It offends a reasonable sense of personal dignity, or 2. The contact is highly offensive to another's unusual sense of personal dignity, and the actor knows that the contact is highly offensive to the other. What is the rule for assault? Assault is established by proof of 1. An intentional act, 2. That places a plaintiff in reasonable apprehension, 3. Of immediate, harmful, or offensive contact with the plaintiff's person. When is apprehension reasonable? Apprehension is reasonable where 1. The plaintiff is aware of the defendant's act, and 2. The plaintiff believes that the defendant is capable of committing the act. What is the rule to remember for false imprisonment? Hint, remember CIA. False imprisonment is established by proof that a defendant 1. Constrains a person to a bounded area, such as with no reasonable means of escape, 2. Intentionally, and 3. The victim must be consciously aware of the confinement at the time or is harmed by it. How is intent established for false imprisonment? For false imprisonment, intent may be established by proving that the defendant 1. Purposely brought about the confinement, or 2. Knew that the confinement was substantially certain to occur. What is the rule to remember for intentional infliction of emotional distress? Liability for intentional infliction of emotional distress attaches when 1. The act was intentional or reckless conduct, 2. The conduct was extreme and outrageous, meaning it transcends the bounds of decency, 3. The act caused extreme emotional distress, and 4. the victim actually suffered severe emotional distress. When may a defendant be found liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress to a third party? Where conduct is directed at a third party, the defendant is liable for intentional infliction of reckless acts that cause severe emotional distress. 1. To members of a person's immediate family who are 2. Present at the time, or 3. Any other person present if such distress results in bodily harm. What is the rule for trespass to land? A defendant is liable for the intentional tort of trespass to land if he or she 1. Intentionally, 2. Physically invades, 3. The land of another. Under what 2 circumstances are actual damages permissible for trespass to land? Recovery for actual damages for a trespass to land are permissible when 1. There is a decrease in the value of the property, or 2. For the cost to repair the property. What is the rule to remember for trespass to chattels? A trespass to chattel occurs where a defendant 1. Intentionally, 2. Causes, 3. An interference or dispossession to a plaintiff's possessory interest in a chattel, 4. Resulting in actual damages. What is the rule to remember for conversion? Conversion occurs where a plaintiff 1. Intentionally, 2. Exercises dominion or control over the chattel of another in a manner that 3. Seriously interferes with the owner's right of control. Is mistaken ownership a viable defense for trespass to land and conversion? Mistaken ownership of property is never a viable defense to the intentional tort of trespass to land or conversion. What are the 8 defenses to intentional torts? Hint, remember the darn cops. 1. Discipline. 2. Authority. 3. Recapture. 4. Necessity. 5. Consent. 6. Defense of others. 7. Property. 8. Self-defense. What is the rule to remember for the defense of consent? Consent may be expressed or implied through either words or conduct. Objective or apparent consent is a strong defense when words or conduct are reasonably perceived to be intended as consent, such as in situations of a customary practice or the plaintiff's failure to object. When does the emergency action consent rule apply? The emergency action consent rule applies where the lack of consent is either necessary or apparently necessary to prevent harm to another. 1. Before there is an opportunity to obtain consent, and 2. Where there is no reason to believe that the other person would decline consent. What are the 2 categories of necessity? Private and public necessity. What is the rule to remember for the defense of private necessity? Under private necessity, a defendant is not liable for harm to the plaintiff's real or personal property if defendant's acts were 1. Necessary or reasonably appear to be necessary, 2. To prevent serious harm to a person or property. Note also that under private necessity, a defendant is always liable for actual damages resulting from his action. What is the rule to remember for the defense of public necessity? Public necessity exists where a defendant, often the government, acts for the public good. Public necessity is a complete defense. Note that public necessity is applicable only to intentional torts against property. What is the rule to remember for self-defense? A defendant charged with an intentional tort is not liable for harm if 1. There is a reasonable belief that the plaintiff was going to harm them or another, and 2. Reasonable force was used, and 3. Defendant's actions were necessary to protect themselves or another. What is the rule to remember for defense of others? A party is allowed to defend another person to the same extent as they would lawfully have been entitled to defend themselves. What is the rule for defense of property? A person is entitled to use reasonable force in preventing a plaintiff from committing a tort against their property. Deadly force is never allowed to defend property. What is the rule for recapture of chattels? An owner may take action and use reasonable, non-deadly force to recover chattels. Note that no force is reasonable, however, until the owner has made a demand for return. This rule applies only unless the demand would have been dangerous or futile. What is the rule for the defense of shopkeeper's privilege? The shopkeeper's privilege provides shopkeepers the privilege of 1. Temporary detention of 2. A person under reasonable suspicion of theft, 3. In or near their store, and 4. For the purpose of investigation. What is the rule to remember for the defense of discipline? The law recognizes that parents may use reasonable force to control, train, and educate children. What is the rule to remember for the defense of authority? Under this defense, both police officers and private citizens may avoid liability where they arrest a person under circumstances where 1. There is a reasonable suspicion that the detainee committed a felony, 2. The detainee witnesses a breach of the peace, or 3. They are acting upon a warrant issued upon probable cause.